So the famous story of Pentecost, which we heard in our first reading today, takes place in Jerusalem. And it's not just any old day in Jerusalem when this takes place. The text says there are many people living there who are from many different countries, but it was actually a festival as well, Shavuot, which is still celebrated in Judaism. And it was a time, one of the three big festivals of the year, when people from all over, Jewish folks from all over the area, would come to Jerusalem to bring their first fruits from the wheat harvest in particular, but really anything they were growing that seemed like a good thing to offer to God at the temple. So the word Pentecost actually was used to describe Shavuot before Christianity. And that's where we get the word Pentecost. It's 50 days. So Shavuot is 50 days after Passover. Pentecost is 50 days after Easter, if you use inclusive counting, for those of you who are really sensitive to numbers being correct. So people from all over, and there were different languages, different cultures gathered in Jerusalem. Joyous time of celebration and generosity. The Torah commanded during this feast for people to share the celebration and their blessings, not just with their families, but also with foreigners, with orphans, with widows. In other words, people who did not have the standard support system of the patriarchal family that was the standard support system at the time. So there was a commandment to just share with everybody, be generous. So I don't know how many of you have spent a good amount of time with people who are different than you are culturally. We've probably all at least had a couple experiences like that, some of us more than others. And when you're in those kind of situations, in my experience, one of two things can happen to a person. The first, a person can become more insular and more protective of their own way of doing things. Because all of the difference feels like a threat to what you know. The other thing that can happen is that a person can start to hold everything more lightly and start to see their own culture through a different lens as well. So it can be a point of disconnection and hostility and arrogance. That can be cross-cultural encounter. Or it can be a time of community and generosity, and what I would call like a playful humility. I think some of the best funny moments of my life come from cross-cultural encounters where things go awry, but everyone has kind of gentleness and generosity with one another. Now, I've read that the characteristics that make someone particularly good at intercultural communication, that is to not, shut down and become protective, all boil down to self-awareness, active listening, high empathy, a tolerance for ambiguity, and behavioral adaptability. The same is true, I think, whenever we have experiences that challenge how we've thought of ourselves, other people, or just how the world works, whether it's interculturally or not. I often feel like I have at least two voices to interpret any surprise or new situation that I come across. One is a kind of naive, trusting voice, and the other is a complete cynic who doesn't even really trust my own experience. Maybe you have those voices too. I actually experience this as well when I'm doing anything creative, music or writing, even writing sermons or decorating my house. It doesn't have to be big, special creative things. Anything I'm doing where I feel like I'm trying something new, there's a part of me that says, oh yeah, this is amazing and creative, and this is a mind-blowing idea. I have to do this right now. It's pure genius. And then there's this other side that says, this only feels mind-blowing, April, because you are so simple-minded and inexperienced. If you do this thing, everyone is going to be embarrassed for you. In the words of my kid, cringe. Now, as some of you know, and some of you know more than the rest of us, and some of you know less, the older we get, one voice tends to get louder than the other. It's not the same for everybody. And I know that for many of you, like me, I'm definitely feeling more and more comfortable the older I get, telling my cynical voice to just be quiet. Mostly because life is so much more fun when you just embrace the cringe. Now, I can certainly imagine the disciples looking kind of cringy at Pentecost. I mean, tongues of fire on each person's head. When I think about this, I was at a restaurant with my kid many, many years ago for Blue's birthday, and I was cold. Now I probably shouldn't cop to this, but I was really, really cold in the restaurant, and they had really big napkins, so I wrapped a napkin around my head, and that was the first time my kid was visibly horrified by being with me. So you can imagine, like, tongues of fire, how much that would be cringy compared to a napkin. So they've got tongues of fire on their heads, speaking different languages. And in fact, we helpfully know that it was a pretty wild scene because we have this little detail that some people sneered at them and accused them of being drunk. Now, Peter, always helpfully trying to explain the situation, says, "What do you mean? It's only 9 a.m. They're not drunk." But I can certainly sympathize with these snarky folks, the cynics, the ones who saw this weird thing happening and just thought, oh man, whatever. Because, people do get drunk and act strangely. That is a real thing that happens in the world. And there are people all over the world, and I would say all over the internet, ready to tell you that the Holy Spirit is upon them and they have a prophecy to share. And we should not be naive and just accept that and go with it. Without some degree of cynicism, which we could also call realism at a certain point, without that, we can get pulled into all kinds of unhelpful directions in life. Pentecost is risky because the crowd has these two options. Either something genuinely new is happening, or these people are fools. Either way, there are risks. Too much naivete, you risk being taken for a ride. Too much cynicism, you risk missing the reality that maybe the world is larger, stranger, and more alive than you thought, which is also a pretty big risk. Maybe you've heard these things, these sneering, cynical remarks in yourself. Maybe you've heard them from other people. There was a friend of the family, I remember in my early 20s when I was I just entered professional ministry. And whenever this man was with us, whenever any hint of religion or faith came up in the conversation, a church could be on TV. It didn't have to be something we were really talking about. He would just look at me and say, well, they all just want your money anyway. And I could never tell if he thought that I wanted people's money, in which case I was a complete failure at my job because I did not have a lot of money, or if he was trying to not so subtly tell me that I was being taken advantage of by people who wanted my money. I wasn't even sure how to begin explaining to him that money had actually very, very little function in my life. And that somehow I hoped to pay my rent every month, and somehow I did. But regardless, I often felt like for him, this cynicism, this sneer that he always brought, it was a kind of defense mechanism for him, which, if we're honest, it can often be for all of us, right? I'm thinking of when someone changes their life radically, the part of it that just kind of goes, midlife crisis. Or someone expresses hope for something that we deem absolutely hopeless, like for world peace. And we sneer and say, oh, you're so naive. That will never happen. You just don't know how the world works. Cynicism makes us the expert in our own little room, right? Which can feel good, but man, it is a pretty small room. There is a spot, I do think, though, in between cynicism and naivete. The word for it in the Christian tradition is discernment. Discernment is, at its root, simply staying open long enough to listen and consider. Where cynicism closes the door before an encounter is truly possible, discernment depends on things like self-awareness, active listening, high empathy, tolerance for ambiguity. We so rarely think of those things as the outcome of a life spent in a religious tradition. But the Pentecost story makes pretty clear that's what should be the outcome of a life spent in a spiritual tradition. Becoming more self-aware, better at listening, having higher empathy, a higher tolerance for ambiguity. That is not what Christianity is known for in popular culture, right? But that is absolutely at the root of the tradition. Pentecost itself is chaotic, loud, confusing, multilingual, emotionally excessive. I'm absolutely sure I would have been completely uncomfortable. It disrupts categories. The Spirit does not arrive looking respectable or controlled. What this means is that the people most committed to maintaining control are probably the least able to recognize it for what it is. Like, if you walked past that scene today, what would you think? Ecstatic speech, noise, crying, confusion. Pentecost asks whether we can tolerate not fully understanding something before dismissing it. And can we be open enough to be changed? And can we adapt the way we live given new understandings? The miracle of Pentecost, I don't think, is actually that everyone suddenly starts to speak the same language. Actually, it's very clear that that's not happening. People are not speaking the same language. People are just able to understand them. The miracle is actually that people remain different, and understanding still becomes possible. The Spirit does not erase difference. It moves through it, across it, between it. The Spirit seems far less interested in making us certain than in making us fully alive. And aliveness is risky business. Love is risky. Openness is risky. Wonder depends on being vulnerable. If you don't ever allow yourself to feel vulnerable, you will never experience wonder. There will always be reasons to retreat into cynicism, to sneer from a distance, to explain away anything that threatens our settled understanding of the world and of ourselves. But cynicism cannot create community. It cannot make meaning. It cannot teach us another person's language. It cannot imagine a future that is different from the past. But the Spirit can. And I think Pentecost asked us not whether we all have the answers, but whether we are willing to stay open long enough to be surprised. Whether we can listen long enough to hear God speaking in voices we did not expect. Whether we can tolerate the discomfort of not fully understanding before rushing to dismiss. Because sometimes the world really is stranger, larger, and more alive than we imagined. And go with me here, but sometimes the people you thought were drunk were actually telling the truth. Thanks be to God.